This is an unusual audience, but just if you're not someone, a friend of mine who I told about Albert Kner, and you're not a family member, how many of you have ever heard of Albert Kner? So a few of you have. Okay, so this is an unusual audience. The most average audience wouldn't have heard of him, and in any case, I was just thinking as I was walking in here that. So much of what we experience are real miracles. So I was walking down the street on the way here, I see a car. There are like probably hundreds of geniuses that went into making a car what it is today, and to make the roads, and to make this building, and to make this screen. There is always something so complex behind the things that that's just part of our normal lives and we ignore. And the same thing when you go through a supermarket or convenience store and you see the packaging on the shelves. Do you ever think, isn't it amazing how you can find what you want, or you can tell what is inside the package very easily? The package, typically the contents are not damaged, they're preserved, typically they're not spoiled. Typically, you can open them up easily if it's well designed and so forth. And is this something that you feel inspired or uplifted by? I would guess probably you don't feel very uplifted by it. But I'm going to explain why you might think differently about packaging and your excursions to the supermarket, because it turns out that there's a Hungarian-American. Originally he was an artist who really pioneered most of the shopping experience that we experience today, and most people don't know him, and I think that he should not be obscure at all. And what's also cool about him is that he was a very prolific artist, and he was so prolific that this entire presentation, almost all of it, is with artwork that he himself created. So I'm telling his life through his own art. And I put in some art from some of his friends as well. So this is Albert, basically, this is his business card in the 1930s, and it's an aerial view of him at his drafting table. You can see him with his art materials and so forth, and you can see the address where his office is. And I thought also, wouldn't it be cool to profile a 20th century Hungarian media pioneer using 21st century Hungarian media technology called Prezi? Maybe some of you have heard of it, but there was three Hungarian guys who 10 or 15 years ago decided that PowerPoint was boring and they wanted to create a more exciting presentation technology. And one of them has gone on to create a chain of schools called the Budapest School. So now he's an education pioneer in Hungary. And so, it just seemed appropriate for me to do it. Why is packaging worthy of wonder? It's just basically, it starts off just a piece of cardboard, a flat piece of cardboard, and it has to be cut and shaped and put together, typically by a machine, because it has to be mass produced into something that's useful. And it seems very simple, but in fact it's not so simple. And the more you get into it, the more you realize how complex it is. And that's what we call sort of the structural side of the packaging puzzle. And then there's the graphic side of the puzzle. And this, for example, is so how is it when you go through the supermarket, you're interacting with dozens or hundreds of different products. How do you figure out very quickly what you want to buy, what you prefer? And Albert was a pioneer of the design. And this is an example of one of his designs. Some client had a product, and this was their design before, and he decided it was terrible. And then this is how he revamped it and how he made it easier to the customer experience better. And I'll go into more detail about it as well. And we'll talk about how the whole magic happens. Some people ask, how did I get involved with this Hungarian inventor? And this is actually the only video that I'm aware of Albert Kner. He's at his desk in Chicago. And you see behind him, there are these bookshelves. And he originally was a book designer. And starting 30 years ago, when I lived in Hungary, I started collecting his books. And that's how I got involved. And that was my first book dealer in Budapest. He was a really fun guy. And he got me hooked on collecting Hungarian books. And I didn't have a lot of money at the time, and I thought it was kind of fun. And I had a business, and I was depressed sometimes for unrelated reasons, and I thought it'd be fun to collect these books. So I started collecting books from the 1920s and 30s, which is a really interesting period of Hungarian history. And even people collect this period in other geographies as well, because you have all these interesting themes. Artistically, you have sort of, this sort of transforming, modernizing Hungarian folk art. You have Cuban, you have all the European sort of artistic trends, Cubism and Expressionism. You have a lot of post-World War I angst and difficulties in processing that disillusionment, urbanization. You have communism, you have modernism, you have Art Deco, folk art, Cubism, so on and so forth. And Bauhaus, Art Deco. And there's so many stories that are told through this period of books, not just the designs, but the contents of these books. And I think so many of these stories are relevant even today in our modern society, 100 years later. And I know this is very frowned upon, but I love judging books by their covers. And this was part of the insight of Albert Kner, that packaging design, and by the way, this is a design of Albert Kner as well from later in Chicago, is that product packaging is like a book cover. It needs to effectively, the cover needs to, or packaging needs to effectively convey the contents and make you want to buy it. And luckily, in researching this book, I was able to find surviving relatives, some of whom are here today, and some of them are in the US. And the ones in the US in particular, the ones in Hungary we had more materials from before, but the ones in the US, we discovered boxes of artwork, photography, and letters, hundreds of letters that had not been read since Albert Kner held them in his hands. So that was really fun to be able to, it brought out a whole story that I think had not been told before. So here's the story. This is actually a fragment of an advertisement Albert did in the 1930s where he used photo montage technique. And this is just to show where he was from, that he was from a part of Hungary about 100 miles from Budapest to the east called Yoma. And it was just far enough from Budapest so that your butt was sore by the time you got there on your Harley Davidson, just as it was running out of gas. And this is when Albert would return home he was living in Budapest as a young adult, and he'd return home to his family in Budapest, in Yoma. And there's Albert with his friend on the motorcycle. He's all dirty because he's going down these dirt roads. And this says a little bit about the relationship with his family. So here he is being greeted, and his father is front and center. He really idolized his father, and Boton was talking about Isidor Kner, who was very famous in Hungary already at that time. And I think it's interesting that he's so prominent in this picture. This is a picture that Albert sketched. And the people behind his father sort of, I don't know if it was his brother and sister or his brother and mother, but they're a little bit fuzzy in the background. And it just sort of shows his relationship with him. And it's interesting because as Boton mentioned, his father was very important in this period of stability and economic prosperity of the Austro-Hungarian Empire during a period of stability before World War I. And things will change so much in Albert's generation, as you'll see in a moment. So his father gets Albert started in the family business from a very early age. And then this is Albert's first book that he typeset and designed. That's about geometry puzzles. Albert was only 12 years old. And this notion of geometry, he clearly had a geometric mind, and that was key in packaging design later. So you can see he was already developing or had innately some mental capacity. And I love this picture. This is Albert with his father dining at Gundel, probably the fanciest restaurant in Budapest at the time. And I just love the facial expression, his father sort of not even paying attention, and Albert sort of hunched over, and I don't know, maybe he's 14 or 13 years old, and he seems awkward, and maybe because he's wearing a suit, or because he's wondering if he'll live up to his father, or sort of not sure what's going on in his mind. But I thought it was an interesting picture. And this gentleman on the left, István Orkanyi, was Albert's first art teacher. And I love this. I wish I had a broody-looking art teacher like this. And Orkanyi was interesting. The middle graphic there is, Orkanyi was sort of hustling in various ways to make a living, and he had a workshop to teach artistic skills to women. And it was clear that he imprinted onto Albert this sort of multimedia concept of art, because his art studio that he ran, taught all sorts of different skills. It taught drawing, it taught painting, it taught design. He taught decorative arts, embroidery, weaving, batik, leatherwork, and so forth. And this was how Albert was early imprinted. And he taught Albert how to paint, and this is one of Albert's painting, a self-referential painting of Albert's bedroom in Gyoma. And unfortunately, his charmed childhood was rudely interrupted, as it was for most people of Albert's generation, because he had to fight in World War I. Well, initially he didn't fight. Initially they saw he was an artist, and they taught him, he did map making for military use, and he did photo montage. And this was a book cover that he designed using photo montage that took a lot of photographs and themes from the war that he had experienced before. And it's so interesting. I love the correspondence from Albert's father while Albert was at war. And it was so clear that there were such generations, because the letters from his father would say, Albert, I'm sending you this bottle of champagne. Between battles, you should sip the bottle, it'll be so nice. And then between battles, you should swim in the rivers of Italy, they're so beautiful. And when you conquer Venice, I think you should get a room at the Bower Hotel, because that's my favorite hotel. And I think you'll enjoy staying there as well. And well, it didn't work out like that. Unfortunately, Albert never conquered Venice, and there was an explosion that landed right next to Albert. Interesting, this is actually a photograph Albert took, presumably of a different mortar shell, not the one that almost hit him. But Albert was, the explosion pushed Albert into a crater, and he was on his back for over 24 hours. And it was raining, and the crater was filling up with water and freezing cold. And eventually he was rescued and brought to a hospital. And that was the end of his fighting effort. But this saying that everything happens for a reason, that sometimes in your tragedies, good things can happen. So the person in the bed next to him was artist Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, who later would help him get settled in Chicago. And I love this photo. So his sister at the time, he had an older sister, Erzsébet, who also we'll talk about and was important in his life. And she writes him a letter at this time when he's in the hospital. She says, I can vividly imagine that when it gets dark, how alone you must feel, so far from home, in such unhuman conditions. But everything passes, Albert. Every day brings you closer to the end. We just pull through. And if you don't achieve peace, you will at least experience freedom. You'll at least experience freedom. And looking at this photo, we have Albert's family and friends. They're dressed for tennis. They have tennis rackets. They seem sort of happy. And here's poor Albert in his military uniform, and he does not look very happy. And in fact, you notice how his face is sort of leaning to one side, and that's a sign of the partial paralysis that he suffered from for the rest of his life. And caricatures or photographs of him, throughout his life show this sort of one side of his face is different from the other. And even, this is of course much older, throughout his life, in order to sleep at night, he had to tape one eye shut. And he also suffered from PTSD, and for a whole year after his injury, he didn't talk, he didn't utter a word. And his father said, just let him be, he needs time to recover. And he started doing rehab from bookbinding and trying to use his hands in the book arts in order to start his physical rehabilitation and his mental rehabilitation. Meanwhile, in the external environment, the Austro-Hungarian Empire falls. You have Hungary, which is torn apart by its clawing neighbors. This is actually a postcard that was issued by Kner Press around that time, right after World War I. And things got, and I think for the Hungarians room, you're very familiar with this, things in Hungary in 1918, 1919 got very, very hard and got very, very weird. The economy completely collapsed. There was an invasion from Romania, so Hungary was largely occupied by Romanian troops. There was a communist revolution where all the assets, including the family business, got seized by the state, and then there was a counter-revolution which laid the seeds to fascism. And I like to collect, so around this time in Hungary, there was an organization called the Hungarian Bibliophile Society. And I love collecting the book plates of the members of the Hungarian Bibliophile Society because they're a little bit like social media profile pictures that they'll depict, for example, kind of what you look like at that time and what you're thinking about what your life is like and maybe what your mental state is. And this is Albert's book plate right after the war. And you can see there's the rubble of the war there, and there's Albert with a shovel. And the inscription on the side say from antiquity new, and from ruins, monuments. And this is actually done by a friend of his, Lajos Kozma, but you can see sort of the monuments rising up from the ruin, and that was his mentality, to rebuild from the war. With a ruined economy, his father and his older brothers made the difficult decision not to give him a place in the family business. And this was a sting of rejection for Albert that really hurt Albert very much, but later would end up saving his life. And so Albert went to Budapest. He had to hustle, he had to make a living. He didn't have a family business family business continued to support him a little bit, but mostly he had to go on his own. And he continued with the book arts, and he designed book covers, and he did book bindings. But that wasn't enough for him to survive during this difficult time, so he had to learn other artistic skills and develop them. So he designed furniture, for example. There he is with some sort of vitrine that he made. He did ball invitations. He did various company work, logos and things like that. He did decorative wrapping paper. He was very good at etching, hand etching things that he would do for printing. He would do stationery. He would do book plates and business cards. He did advertisements. So I love this advertisement for Modiano cigarettes to show how you can smoke from the time you're born all the way to the time you're in the coffin. It seems like a good life. And then he also made games. Like he would design all the rules for the games and all the pieces and everything. And he did tons of games. And so, you can see how he was very prolific. Oh, he also did stage sets. I could never find a picture of a stage set he designed. But this is a merchandising display in a department store in Chicago, and it made me think, merchandising displays are kind of like stage sets. So it kind of reminds me of a stage set, that's why I put it here. And he started doing packaging design in the 1920s and 30s. And so this hardship that he faced actually forced him to develop these skills. And here he is, after that horrible injury and partial paralysis, he got really good at hand etching linoleum, lead, wood, and so forth. So, and he had this skill his father had this skill. And not only was he a great artist, but he ended up being hired to manage a printing company, not his family company, but a different one. And so he learned the business of printing company. He was art director for another printing company. And this became critical later because not only did he understand art, but he understood the production process. He understood how having customers and making customers happy. And unlike a lot of artists who they would just have a certain style, Albert was artistic chameleon. He liked experimenting with different styles, but also he had a lot of customers that had different tastes, and he had to kind of do what they wanted. So he developed so many skills. He did Orientalism. He did sort of Art Nouveau, Surrealism, Expressionism, Constructivism, Art Deco, Bauhaus style, and you can see all these different things. And then this is about 10 years later, this on the left-hand side, this is his next book plate, and you can see the stage of life where it's a very frenetic, he's holding these sheets of paper and they're falling out as if kind of like he's struggling to hold his life together. And in one of the letters that we found, he writes a friend saying that I wake up every morning with suicidal thoughts. I don't have a penny, only debt, I'm in pain, I'm suffering. I've never longed as much as I do now to lay my head in someone's lap and tell everything that's been tormenting me for years. And so he clearly had an inner life that there was a lot going on in his inner life, some of which we don't know, and some of which was probably the result of some of the difficult situation that he faced. And yet, this cartoon that came out around the time, he says, why do I need money when I love women? And in 1933, he married Susan, and she had a previous marriage to an American citizen, and that was helpful. That became helpful later on. And I love this family photograph of a dinner party going on. And I just love, like, 'cause I look closely at it, I see all these little vignettes. I'm sorry, it's not showing up too well on the screen, but people playing with kids and playing games and just sort of lounging, contemplating, and then the people, the dinner table. And then I see Albert there on the left-hand side looking up. He always seemed to know where the camera was. I noticed that about him. And he seems happy. And so somehow, like, despite all these hardships and all these problems he experienced, he found some community, he found some things to be happy with, and there's evidence of that too. So it's not, it's a multifaceted sort of mental situation for him. His father sent him for more training, so sent him to the Wiener Werkstätte in Vienna to do more training. He went to Leipzig for more book design, typography. He was at the Bauhaus for some time. So he was really, subsidized by his family. He picked up a lot of the kind of the European artistic movements going on. And he came back to Budapest from these experiences to start with some other artist friends, something called the Budapest Atelier. And you see a repeating story here. This atelier had, according to its brochures, they would teach their students graphic design, photography, clothing and fashion, textiles, ceramics, furniture design, and the intersection of all these crafts. And one of his students at the atelier was a gentleman by the name of George Kepes, who later went to Chicago and then to Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he founded this thing called the Center for Advanced Visual Studies. And that later became the very famous MIT Media Lab. So I'm making the claim that Albert was some sort of ancestor of the MIT Media Lab as an evidence of his legacy. So this is a picture, a decade goes by and the relationship, he makes a series of photos that feature his father that he wrote that these are joke photos. So I'm not really sure what was going on here with this photo. Apparently, his father, the doctor told his father he was going blind, so the father turned over the business to Albert's older brothers. And it was said that his father loved going to bathhouses in Italy. So maybe this is sort of a doctor's scene of that. But some things, he's doing these joke photos about his father. And then here's another one where he takes a picture of his father standing up on a podium, and then he creates this photo montage that. He splices Hitler in it, and at this point, Hitler's really a joke at this point in the early 30s. And it's interesting and sad how some leaders, they start out as jokes and then they become very serious and dangerous. And this even happens in the modern world that we live today. And around this time, Albert had started to get clients who were even outside of Hungary. So he had a client in Munich. And the meeting with his client was the next day, and the hotel receptionist said, well, if you have a free evening, Adolf Hitler's giving a speech, why don't you go see it? So Albert goes and sees it. And Albert jokes later that he was so swept up in the excitement, he almost jumped up himself to say Heil Hitler. And this was clearly dark humor on Albert's part because he was Jewish. And not long after that, he returned home to his wife. And he told her that it was time to think about emigrating from Hungary. And this is where I say that his not working for the family business saved his life, because his older brothers, who had, and in the correspondence we have from them, they said, yeah, we wouldn't mind immigrating too, but we have a business, we have all these employees, we have a factory. How are we going to leave all that behind? But Albert was a free agent, and he could more easily leave. And that's why I say that his being excluded from the family business saved his life. Another thing I like to collect is the Kner Press sends out a New Year's card every year, and they're usually very cheerful, but the one for 1939 has a cloud moving in front of the sun, and it has an olive branch being brought by a dove, and so it was sort of a more foreboding card. And the Kner family logo, the Kner Press logo this was a reference to Albert's grandfather, who was an itinerant bookseller, but it presages Albert's next stage of life, this sort of itinerant stage of life. And at this point in time, Albert and Susan have a young daughter, and they have a son. And I guess the Hungarians in the room, do you know the storybook Kokosi és Bobosa? Are you familiar with it? So, did you know that that story is a story about Albert Kner?
No.
Yeah. So Török Sándor was Albert Kner's best friend. And you know how some children's stories, the best children's stories, in my opinion, they have a message for the kids and they have a message for the adults at the same time. And this was really about, as I interpret it, this story is really about the anxiety that the children face, especially the young son, Andris, who was 4 years old. This anxiety that the Kner household felt before immigration. Because in the story, Albert comes home from work, he's tired and sad. Albert and Susan speaking a language the son doesn't understand, they're practicing English. Susan spoke good English, but Albert always had problems with English. Albert avoids looking to the eyes of his son at dinner. He complains that kids are expensive. Then he worked late at the dining table. At one point, Albert hit his son, and when he played too loud, and then the son went and pulled the tail of the cat. So, and in one of Albert's letters, he states that he felt this sort of, it was a time of crisis and anxiety. And so it was a hard time psychologically for him, but he had to move on with his life. And he created a portfolio of all of his artwork, hoping to get employer jobs in Chicago. So for example, you can see he did a whole portfolio of his book bindings and other posters and so forth, various press clippings, fancy paper and folding cartons, typographic ornaments. He did a treatise on the relationship between printer and customer. He did a catalog of his games. He did Ludlow typeface. And then he did this thing called 40 Schemes of Packing, where he had these prototypes of 40 different types of packaging that he designed. And this is Albert's grandson in Chicago, who actually still has the portfolio there, so it was so exciting to find that still in existence. And you can see for each package, basically you have this two-dimensional piece of cardboard and exactly how you cut it and fold it up in order to make a three-dimensional package. And so you can imagine how it would be impressive for a potential employer. So this is Béla Balázs. He was a famous filmmaker, a Hungarian filmmaker. Maybe some of you have heard of him. And around this time, he happened to be making a movie about Chicago. And this was a movie. This movie was an anti-capitalist movie about how Chicago. Balázs had never been to the U.S. before, but he went to special anti-capitalist training in the Soviet Union. And the movie was about how Chicago has these industrialists that fight each other with street gangs, and they create all sorts of crime and mayhem. And what these industrialists do is they hire young geniuses like Albert, and what they give them very small salaries, and then send them cocaine and prostitutes in order to suck all the inventions out of them. And so Balázs told Albert, he said, don't do it. He said, don't go to America, this is terrible. You're only trading fascism for duplicitous capitalism. You should really go to the Soviet Union, things will be much nicer there, et cetera, et cetera. And at the same time, Albert this was a sample advertisement that Albert did, which I think maybe Albert had based on this, had a more optimistic mindset toward Chicago, because he depicts lawn fairs and parties and sort of, nice entertainment and so forth. And he also talks about investments that don't lose money, that do very well. And so I think this is a sign that Albert had hopefully optimistic feelings, or tried to have optimistic feelings about how life would be in Chicago. So he was met in Chicago, he and his family, by his former student George Kepes and by László Moholy-Nagy, and they helped to get him an interview with this gentleman, Walter Paepcke. And did any of you see the movie The Brutalist with Adrian Brody? It came out recently. So it's almost certain that the character Mr. Van Buren was based on this guy. And except it doesn't have the weird ending. The real story doesn't have the weird ending that the movie had. Anyone who saw the movie knows what I'm talking about. But what was great about Paepcke was that he had this philosophy that he was maybe one of a minority of business people who thought that art was very important for business. And he was willing to invest in art. And he thought also that business should fertilize art. So we saw this symbiotic relationship between art and business. And he hired Albert, and he said, look, we spent all these years making cardboard durable, but now Albert, I want you to make cardboard beautiful. And so Albert said, sure, I'll make cardboard beautiful. But Papke sends Albert to work in this factory, and he forgets to tell the other employees who Albert is and why he's there. So poor Albert, he sits in this office, and no one has any idea who he is. And they poke their heads in, and he doesn't really speak English. So they're like, who is this guy who doesn't speak English, and why is he here? And Albert starts to panic because he thinks, I'm going to lose my job. Nobody's interested in what I'm doing. But as in so many situations, you always find some clever way out of a bad situation. He starts making erotic art and hangs it up throughout his office. Suddenly, his office, all of the colleagues come in, and they want to know about Albert. They want to talk to him and hear about him. And that was his opportunity to show them packaging designs. And so one of the great things about why Albert's more than just an artist, because he ran a commercial operation, he knew it was very important that you can't have art unless somebody sold it, unless you had some revenue from it. So you need to have a relationship with salespeople. You need to have a power of persuasion to persuade them to that your product is something that they can sell to customers. And in this period of 2 years, starting in 1940, when he emigrated, he literally invented over 1,400 inventions related to packaging. And his first customer is Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola came to him and said, can you make a bottle carrier that will carry bottles out of cardboard? And there had already been wooden and metal ones, but they were cumbersome, they were expensive, you had to return them for a deposit and so forth. Plus the war was happening at this point, and the war industry needed metals and wood, so they said, Albert, can you we want an 8-pack, we want to carry the 8-pack. And the other skill that Albert had, he knew the machinery couldn't do an 8-pack. He said, yes, I can do it, but I can only do it for 6 bottles, not 8 bottles. So that's why we call it a 6-pack, not an 8-pack today. You can see here some other alternate versions of, early versions of the 6-pack that happened. And then one of his other early customers he did a lot in cigarettes, so he designed the flip-top cigarette package that we use today. And he also did a lot of not only structural design of cigarettes, that's Albert on the left-hand side, but a lot of the graphic designs of cigarettes that we're all familiar with. And he did all sorts of different things. I mean, he did war rations with camouflage designs. He did ammunition. He did war posters. He did graphic design for many brands we're familiar with today, like Betty Crocker, Kraft Macaroni and Cheese. Everything he looked at, he thought, can I do it with cardboard? Can I do it with cardboard? He did cardboard magazine rack, Cracker Jacks, toys, glasses. He pioneered the multi-record, how to do multiple records in one case. He even did Christmas ornaments that were made out of cardboard. And here he is, Christmas of 1943. By this point, he was allowed to hire some other designers, mostly fellow immigrants from Europe. And he created something called Design Laboratory, which was the official design department of the company Container Corporation. And here they did wrapping paper. They did all sorts of different things. Some of his inventions were not so successful. For example, this one, these were beer cans that when you opened them, they ignited fireworks. So that was not really such a big success in the end. We don't see it today. And then of course there's the hot dog bun shaped bottle carrier, which is not so successful. And then also, Albert got so excited about designing packages, he created a game where you can design your own packages. And it turns out that people they just wanted to have packages to buy them in the store. They didn't really want to make their own packaging design. So, here's Albert. I feel kind of similar to the Bauhaus and similar to Budapest Atelier about he's presenting packaging design as this sort of multifaceted operation. And this is reflected in his office. He spent so much attention to all aspects of design, including his offices. So, is not working? Is this working? Okay, it is. So I love the mid-century modern style of the photography that he did with the fedoras and so forth. And this is another display that he did that shows all the different people involved in packaging design. So there are 30 different people, each with different roles and so forth. And here's another display that shows that packaging design is like a wheel, and if you don't have all the spokes, the wheel won't go. And this was presumably to impress customers and to convince them that prospective customers that they were the best place to contract with for packaging design. He also created, with still the wartime shortages for toy materials, he created this whole line of toys called slotties, which are basically cardboard cutouts that you would fit together into different shapes. And they came in boxes, and you can still get them on eBay sometimes, and he also did books that had slotty toys in the back. And here's one called The Elegant Elephant, which had a whole story, and Albert was also one of his talents. He was a great showman, so not only did he make a book that had these toys in the back, but he hired an elephant to come sign the books. And here he is with an ink stamp that people would come and he would sign the books with an ink stamp. So, it takes some chutzpah to be able to do this kind of thing. And yet, you get the impression from this that this was a joyful time for Albert. He was achieving all of these things, but his correspondence showed a different side. For example, he wrote his wife around this time. He said, "I'm completely broken physically and mentally. I've never been such a dog. When I'm working, I can hold myself together, but afterwards I'm tormented." So this period of industry and productivity came with a mental cost for him. And I think part of that was worrying about his family back in Hungary and his friends back in Hungary. And for the first couple of years, before there was official war between the US and Hungary, he could get letters from his friends. And so here's an example of one of them. A friend writes, "We don't read newspapers, we don't listen to the radio, we barely go among people, we prefer just to be at home together. But then I worry, aren't we behaving like ostriches? Budapest is full of German soldiers. When a German car stops on the street, people stand around and stare as if a horse had collapsed. The soldiers are cheerful, they eat a lot, they drink, they shop. Every cafe and pub is full of them. People love the Germans, most of the time. Then when the US and Hungary were at war, it was almost impossible to communicate. The Red Cross had a program where you could communicate back and forth, but it was very limited. You could only say things like, 'We are well,' without any change. And even things, you can see from the black blotches what was censored out. So you could barely have any communication for a few years. And then, as many of you know, Budapest was taken over by an ultra-fascist regime at the end of World War II, the Nyilashes. And it was heavily bombed by Allied forces. And the winter of 1944 to 45 was the height of devastation, starvation, extreme cold, violence. And there are lots of pictures like this is basically what Budapest looked like at the time. So you can imagine. Unfortunately, most of Albert's family was shipped to concentration camps or to the war front where they perished. But Albert only found out at the end of the war. Correspondence resumed after a gap. And Albert started sending care packages to Hungary. At one time, there were 46 care packages en route to family members and friends. And I think I want to recognize Guri, who's here over there. Guri, was this in your home? I think, yeah, that was. He's nodding his head. So Guri is actually the nephew-in-law of Albert Kner. He's married to Agi Haiman. And this was in their house. This is one of the care packages that Albert sent, which is still, I think, on your wall, or used to be on your wall. And I also want to say, another thing about Guri is that he ran the parent company of Kner Press for 20 years. So not only is he a family member, but he's involved in the family business. And then we have also his brother-in-law, Pali, who's here, and his son, Tamash, and wife, Tuba. And then the next generation is here too. So anyway, just want to recognize some Kner family members who are here. It's nice that you're here. Okay. There were some tough letters that came in around this time from Albert's family. Here's one letter from Albert's niece. Her brother died in the war, and then Albert's brother, her father died in the war, and then her brother committed suicide right at the end of the war. And she writes this letter about after a care package was received from Albert and Susan. She said, "I can't describe how moved I was by the attention you devoted to your latest care package. I returned home with nothing more than a few threads of lice-infested clothes. It's starting to get hot now, but I can't take off the black. Loneliness is terrible. Everything is so empty, so meaningless. My life used to be music, but after the liberation, I played piano after 12 hours of factory work. Now I don't care about music anymore. I go to a concert, I find myself not hearing it. My mind wanders to something else. After a lot of loneliness, I went to the other extreme. I go out among people all the time now. I'm afraid to be by myself. I go to the cinema, to the theater, to the idiotic cabaret, so that maybe for a half hour I can forget everything. But it doesn't work. Don't be alarmed though, because I'm relatively normal compared to the other deportees. They are, for the most part, utterly insane. I long passionately for a home, a corner that is mine, for a calm, clean, and new life. I long for love, but everything in me is burnt out. I lie in the river and wish it to whisk me away. Let the waves take me somewhere, and then I will feel at home. Around this time, Albert writes his sister, Erzsébet. He says, "We're sending you a package that is unusually cluttered. I included a raccoon skin. I hope you can use it. The raccoon is a small animal, but very kind. We also sent cornflakes. This is a very cheap food served for breakfast. I sent it for 2 reasons. Both the kids and I love eating cornflakes for every blessed breakfast. Plus, it's a pride of my work life. We make 6 million boxes a month for them. You put cornflakes in a bowl, put powdered sugar on it, and put milk on it. I hope you will love it too." Erzsébet writes back, she said that she couldn't try the cornflakes yet because of the milk shortages in Hungary, but she used the raccoon to make a bookbinding. And this is her business card in Budapest, likely designed by Albert in the 1930s before the war. And during the siege, she hid in her bindery at this address on Alkotman utca and survived. Pictured here on the right, Robert Kner joined Albert in Chicago in 1949, where she recreated her Budapest book workshop along with a chain-smoking Spanish emigre on the left, and she trained a whole new generation of book artists in the United States. Albert continued to innovate, so whenever you're in a convenience store or supermarket and you see the cardboard end aisles that displays that promote things and so forth, these were all inventions of Albert. Also, he pioneered in-package promotional games, so things like in cornflakes and Cheerios and other breakfast cereals, and you collect in each box a different object that you put together. And here in the video I'm going to show you in a second, you can see how he applied these principles of the Bauhaus and the Budapest Atelier and his instructor to packaging design.
Correct. Each related to all. All related to each. First is material, then structure, research, machinery, graphic design, printing and production, and marketing. Together, these components comprise the packaging system, a unique development by Container Corporation of America.
Okay, so anyway, I talked so far about the structural elements of packaging design, the graphical elements of packaging design. There's a third element of packaging design that he pioneered, and that is the market research side of packaging design. And Albert invented or adapted these futuristic gadgets to test packaging effectiveness. This is called the perceptimeter, and what it did was it would flash a product package design for a fraction of a second, and then the test subject would write down what they remember. And the package design that has the most impact in the shortest period of time, that's the winning package design. And then he has something called the variable diffuser that he invented, which basically smudges or obscures and blurs and makes darker the package design. That's for Kleenex in this particular video. And the package design that pierces through distortions best is considered the best. And that's another example, another photograph of it. And then this is called the angle meter. So this is designed to simulate when you walk down a supermarket aisle and you see a package only from an acute angle, and you really perceive what's in the product well. And so that's what that is. And here's another picture of the angle meter. And then finally the pupilometer. So the pupilometer the subject sits there, and there are two competing package designs, and there's a camera that actually tracks your eye movements, and it figures out where are your eyes drawn to between two competing package designs, and and the one that captures your attention the most is the winning design. And here's Albert again testing different designs for saran wrap, and so we have actually, so it's interesting. So here's a caricature of Albert at the time, and I was wondering, are these gadgets really? They certainly look very cool, but were they useful? And you see this quote that was attributed to Albert, where he says, "You sons of bitches." Apparently, he would call people sons of bitches. He was able to get away with it because he was considered this sort of crazy Hungarian guy. He said, "This research is a lot of bullshit, and design is nothing but monkey business." But was that really what he thought? That it was all nonsense what he was doing? Because I interviewed people, and is Katie here by chance? Yeah, there she is there. So there's the company. This isn't the exact what you're mentioning, but as I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, Katie, you still use this today so her company Behaviorally, which is based in New York and here and other places, actually uses these same techniques today to test packaging design. So it's really it's not something that was nonsense. It's something that's endured over decades. And in the research, it came up that people use these things to test websites, to test phone applications. So every time you use your mobile phone, you can perhaps thank Albert Kner. Albert died in 1976. His obituary summed up his life as follows: he took packaging design into uncharted territory. A sensitive, empathetic man, deeply committed to quality, open to exploring screwball ideas, which often led to breakthrough innovations. He retired from Container Corporation in 1964, almost 60 years ago. I thought it'd be cool to interview people who worked with him, but who would remember someone from 60 years ago? Amazingly, I found people mostly in retirement homes who totally remembered him super well. I mean, they would have been artists in their 20s when Albert was in his 60s, and they could tell jokes about him. They could imitate his Hungarian accent. I was really amazed. Even sometimes I would find the children of his colleagues, and they would remember the stories from their dads telling about Albert Kner, including, for example, rampant pranks, including this one about a cardboard gorilla that they put behind Albert Kner's desk. Albert curated his office environment with nods to his origins in the book art, so you can see this demonstration of typography up on the top of this drawing here. And then this is Albert's office, and I just want to go back to, I make the claim in the book that the origins of packaging design really come from the book arts, and you see that because you see the top row on the left, those are book covers that Albert designed while in Hungary, and then the next two rows are his favorite packaging designs, so you can see a direct link between the two. Albert wrote the following about his struggles. He said, "Failures in life are easy to explain. It's the successes that are difficult to explain. I was saved by one corny idea. I imagine that I'm struggling like a boxer in the ring. A good boxer has to be ready for a blow any minute from any direction. I think that this works in life. You just adjust or change course to eliminate difficulties." Common conception may be that consumer packaging is some form of lowbrow art. For example, Warhol's Campbell soup cans, the Brillo boxes, were they jokes on gullible art collectors, or were they some sort of commentary on the intersection between art and culture? One packaging designer I interviewed talked about packaging design as some sort of intersection of the worlds of design, structure, and the social environment. He said it's very similar to the field of architecture, which I thought was kind of cool. It turned out, I had no idea this when I started collecting Albert's book, but I discovered I had a family connection with Albert Kner because my grandfather, after Albert retired, engineered a merger of Albert's company with my grandfather's company, and it was called Montgomery Ward, which is a long time ago was the second largest retailer in the United States, and Montgomery Ward at that time processed 50 million transactions a year. And what my grandfather thought was that better packaging and distribution would make products cheaper and more efficient. It would improve prices for consumers. I'm sure he thought it would improve profits for his company too. And so you could say that Albert contributed to the invisible hand of commerce in the world economy. This is my co-author, Adam Erde, so I did it along with him. He used to be the chief archivist of Gyula, or Bekesmegye, which is a county in eastern Hungary, where Kner Press was. And he also was the gentleman behind a theatrical play featuring of this story, and the actor on the left plays Albert Kner, and you never know, maybe it'll be in the West End of London one day, this performance about Albert Kner. So next time you come across any of these designs, and this is a film of products that he designed in his design lab, think of Albert Kner. I make the argument that he had a greater impact on the modern world than any other Bauhaus-associated artist, considering that we encounter his designs in our daily lives. But hardly anyone has heard of Albert Kner. And maybe I wonder sometimes if his friend Béla Balázs there was something right about when he said that industrialists exploited talented genius, because Albert Kner is so obscure and not known, even if they didn't use cocaine and prostitutes in reality. But I'm pretty sure from the correspondence that I read that Albert considered himself quite satisfied with his life in Chicago, even though he was haunted by his past and he was haunted by the suffering of his family. And if you want to read more, you can find the book of Albert Kner. It's available at the Whitechapel Gallery or online for sale. And I really appreciate you being here and listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions people have. Thank you.